There is a printed volume in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. It is a small octavo, perhaps 20 centimetres tall, bound in dark cloth. It was published in London in 1840 by John Murray. Its title page bears 3 Sanskrit words rendered into English. The Vishnu Purana. Its translator was Horace Hayman Wilson, Boden Professor of Sanskrit at Oxford. The Sanskrit text inside is centuries older than its binding. It describes the Manvantara structure of cosmic time. It names 7 ages of pre-human governance, each ruled by a different Manu, each with its own pantheon of gods, its own 7 sages, its own Indra. The 7th, ruled by Vaivasvata Manu, is the one we currently inhabit. The other 6 have ended, each ended in a flood. The flood that began the 7th is the same flood the Sumerians recorded on a tablet they called the King List, which Stephen Langdon translated at Oxford in 1923. 2 cultures, the same breakpoint, the same surviving figure, the same count of 7. It is called the Vishnu Purana. What happened when Zecharia Sitchin read its numbers as chronology rather than symbolism is one of the strangest correspondences in the history of comparative mythology. The Vishnu Purana is one of the 18 great Puranas of Hindu tradition. Each is a long verse text in Sanskrit, composed in the meter known as Anushtuba Shloka, 32 syllables to a verse, 2 lines, 4 feet. The Vishnu Purana runs to approximately 23,000 verses by traditional reckoning, arranged across 6 books which the tradition calls amshas. Book 3 is the section that contains the Manvantara doctrine. It opens with a question. The sage Maitreya asks his teacher Parashara to explain the structure of cosmic time. Parashara answers across 4 chapters. That answer is the spine of what follows in this video. Mainstream Sanskritist scholarship dates the surviving redaction of the Vishnu Purana to approximately the early centuries of the Common Era. Most consensus estimates fall between the 3rd and 7th centuries CE for the version we have. Horace Hayman Wilson, in his 1840 introduction, placed it somewhat earlier. More recent academic work, by scholars such as Wendy Doniger of the University of Chicago and Ludo Rocher, formerly of the University of Pennsylvania, has refined this dating but accepted the broader range. The text, as a physical artifact, as a manuscript tradition, is roughly 2,000 years old. But the cosmological material the text encodes is not from that period. The Manvantara framework, the lists of 14 manas, the durations measured in millions of years, appear already in older Sanskrit sources. They are referenced in the Mahabharata, which scholarly consensus dates to between the 3rd century BCE and the 4th century CE. They appear in the Manusmriti, which the Sanskritist Patrick Olivelle dates to roughly the 2nd century CE. They appear in the Bhagavata Purana, the Markandeya Purana, the Brahmanda Purana. The framework is older than any of the texts that record it. The thesis of this video is this. The Vishnu Purana describes 7 completed ages of pre-human governance, each ruled by a being it names a Manu, each lasting hundreds of millions of years by the text's own reckoning. It describes the current age, the 7th, as inaugurated by a flood that destroyed the previous order and from which a single human ancestor, Vaivasvata Manu, was saved by divine warning. It gives durations, it gives lineages, it gives the names of the gods who ruled in each era, and explicitly states that these gods are different in each Manvantara. The Indra of the prior Manvantara was not the Indra of the current Manvantara. The 7 sages of the prior age were not the 7 sages of this one. The same structure, 7 completed ages, ruled by beings with vast lifespans, terminated by a flood from which a single human ancestor survives, appears in the Sumerian King List, which is housed at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It appears in fragments of the Egyptian dynastic chronology, compiled by the priest Manetho in the 3rd century BCE. 3 independent textual traditions, separated by thousands of kilometres and recorded in 3 unrelated scripts, transmit the same structural account. This correspondence has been described in print. It has been catalogued. It has not been refuted. The published academic response to it has been, with 1 or 2 exceptions, silence followed by characterization. If you find that the academic literature on the Puranas has been incomplete, if you suspect there are correspondences sitting in plain text in Wilson's translation that nobody has been willing to engage seriously, this channel is for that work. Subscribe only if that is the question you have been looking for. The rest of us continue. The conventional academic reading of the Manvantara doctrine is that it is a theological structure, not a chronological record. The mainstream interpretation, as articulated by Sanskritists working in the European and American university tradition over the past 180 years, runs as follows. The Puranas are religious texts. They were composed and transmitted by Brahmin scholars whose purpose was devotional, philosophical, and pedagogical. The vast durations they record, the Manvantara of approximately 306,720,000 years, the Kalpa of approximately 4,320,000,000 years, the lifespan of Brahma of approximately 311,040,000,000,000 years, are not historical claims on the conventional reading. They are devices for inducing in the listener a particular religious effect. The intended response is humility. The vastness of the cosmic timescale collapses human pride. The reader is meant to feel small. To take the numbers as chronology is, on this reading, to misread the genre. Horace Hayman Wilson, in his 1840 introduction, treats the Manvantara framework as a form of sacred allegory. He notes its presence in the Vishnu Purana, but suggests that its significance lies in its symbolic structure rather than its arithmetic. F. Max Müller, the Oxford Sanskritist who edited the 50-volume Sacred Books of the East series beginning in 1879, took a similar position. The Puranic timescales in his reading were the product of theological elaboration, a Brahmanical attempt to project sacred order onto vast and unknowable durations. This reading has been reinforced through the 20th century and into the 21st. Wendy Doniger, who served as the Mircea Eliade Distinguished Service Professor of the History of Religions at the University of Chicago, and who translated and commented on several Puranic texts, treats the Manvantara structure as a sophisticated mythological device. Her position is that the Puranas are doing theology, not chronology, and that conflating the two is a category error. Ludo Roche's volume on the Puranas in the Harasowitz series, published in 1986, surveys the textual evidence and arrives at the same conclusion. Patrick Olivelle, who has translated the Manusmriti and other Dharmasastra texts, treats the cosmological numbers as features of the ritual imagination rather than of empirical record-keeping. The functional purpose of the Manvantara framework on the conventional reading is fourfold. First, it provides a cosmological frame within which the Hindu ritual calendar can be located. Second, it gives the doctrine of cyclical time, the eternal return of Yugas and Manvantaras, its mathematical scaffolding. Third, it offers a theology of divine succession in which the gods themselves are not eternal, but rule for specific durations before being replaced. Fourth, it underwrites the doctrine of karma and rebirth by establishing that the soul migrates through ages too vast for any individual lifespan to track. This is the orthodox academic reading, and it is not stupid. The Puranas are religious literature. They were composed by priests, not historians. The Brahmanical tradition does not draw the same line between theology and chronology that modern historiography draws. To read the Manvantara framework as a religious structure is to read it in its own tradition's terms. There is something condescending in the alternative reading. The suggestion that the priests who composed these texts were secretly recording empirical observations and merely dressed them up in theological language. So this is the starting position. The conventional view is that the Manvantara doctrine is theology. It is meant to do religious work, not chronological work. Anyone who reads it otherwise is, on the conventional view, misreading the text. That is what mainstream Sanskritist academia has said for the past century and a half. The question is what the text actually says when its specific numbers are compared to the specific numbers in independent textual traditions on the other side of the world. In 1990, a researcher named Zechariah Sitchin published a book titled The Lost Realms. It was the fourth volume in a series he called The Earth Chronicles. The first volume, The 12th Planet, had appeared in 1976, and the series had developed through 3 intervening books a comparative thesis about ancient cosmologies. The Lost Realms was the volume in which Sitchin extended that thesis from Mesopotamia and Egypt into the Americas, and in 2 chapters, into the Vedic textual record of India. Sitchin's credentials, to address them up front, were unconventional. He was not a Sanskritist by formal training. He held a degree from the University of London in economic history. He had spent decades teaching himself to read Sumerian cuneiform and had developed his own interpretive methodology. Mainstream Assyriologists and Sanskritists alike have characterized his work as outside the discipline. He died in 2010 without having produced the kind of academic credentialing that would have given his readings institutional weight. But the methodology of the Lost Realms, in the 2 chapters that concern us, is not an opaque mystical exegesis, it is comparative arithmetic. Sitchin laid out three textual traditions side by side: the Sumerian King List, in its earliest preserved form on the Weld-Blundell Prism at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, which Stephen Langdon translated and published in 1923, the Egyptian dynastic chronology of the priest Manetho, transmitted in fragmentary citations through later Greek and Christian writers, including Eusebius and Africanus, and the Vedic Manvantara framework as it appears in the Vishnu Purana, the Bhagavata Purana, and the Mahabharata. His procedure was to ask whether the three traditions, when stripped of their devotional language and reduced to their numerical scaffolding, were describing the same underlying structure. The conclusion he arrived at, and which has not, in the intervening 3.5 decades, been substantively engaged in peer-reviewed Sanskritist or Assyriological literature, was that they were. The structural correspondence runs as follows. All three traditions describe a sequence of pre-human governance by beings of immense longevity. All three describe that sequence as ending in a flood. All three describe a single human survivor from whom the present human population descends. The Sumerian survivor is Ziusudra, named at the close of the antediluvian section of the King List. The Egyptian survivor, in Manetho's reckoning, is associated with the close of the dynasties of demigods and the beginning of the human pharaonic line. The Vedic survivor is Vaivasvata Manu, who is warned by the Matsya avatar of Vishnu, and who survives the great flood that ends the previous Manvantara and inaugurates the current one. Sitchin's specific claim, and this is the one to focus on, is that the survivor in all three traditions stands at the same numerical position in the count of pre-flood ages. In the Sumerian King List, the antediluvian kings number either 8 or in some recensions 10, with a total combined reign of approximately 241,200 years. The flood occurs at the close of this sequence. In the Vedic framework, the 6 prior Manvantaras have already ended, and the 7th, the current one, is the one inaugurated by Vaivasvata's survival of the flood. The pattern is the same: a finite count of pre-flood ages, a flood event, a survivor. The current order begins with the survivor. The duration arithmetic also corresponds in ways that are difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The combined antediluvian reign of 241,200 years on the Weld-Blundell Prism is, by Sitchin's analysis, related by a simple ratio to the corresponding Vedic durations. The Indian framework gives a Manvantara as 71 Mahayugas, which works out to approximately 306,720,000 years. The Sumerian and Vedic figures are not identical, but they are related, Sitchin argued, by what looks like a unit conversion factor rather than a coincidence of religious imagination. The break in the conventional reading happens here. The conventional reading says the Manvantara numbers are devotional, inflation. They are large because Brahmin priests wanted them to be large. The reasoning is internal to the Vedic tradition. The numbers have no external referent. Sitchin's claim is that they do have an external referent. The same structural pattern at the same position in the count, with mathematically related durations, appears in 2 traditions that the conventional account treats as unrelated. Sumerian cuneiform was first deciphered in the 1850s, long after the Sanskrit Puranas had been studied in Europe. There was no opportunity for the Brahmin compilers of the Puranas to borrow from Mesopotamian texts, and the Mesopotamian texts predate the Sanskrit ones by at least a millennium in the form we have them. If the structural correspondence is real, the conventional explanation runs out of room. The 2 traditions are too geographically distant, too chronologically separated, and too quantitatively precise in their correspondence to be explained by ordinary cultural diffusion or shared archetypal imagination. Sitchin's training is not what gives the argument its weight. The argument's weight comes from the comparative arithmetic, which any researcher can in principle redo. The Weld-Blundell Prism is at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. The Vishnu Purana is in Wilson's 1840 translation in the Bodleian. Anyone who wants to check the calculation has access to both texts. The break in the conventional reading is not that Sitchin was right. The break is that no one in mainstream Sanskritist or Assyriological scholarship has shown him to be wrong on the specific structural and numerical point. The dismissals, and there have been many, have been characterizations of his methodology, not engagements with his arithmetic. If Sitchin's structural correspondence is taken seriously, If the Vedic Manvantara framework and the Sumerian King List are read as parallel records of the same observational substrate rather than as independent religious inventions, then a number of things follow that conventional historiography is not currently set up to accommodate. The first is that the descriptions of pre-human civilization in the Puranas would have to be read as something other than priestly cosmology. The texts describe specific governance structures, specific ruling pantheons, specific lineages of sages, specific durations of dominion. The Vishnu Purana, in Book 3, names the gods of the prior Manvantaras. The chief deity of the first Manvantara, the Svayambhuva Manvantara, was not Indra, it was Yajna. The sages of that age were a different set from the sages of this one. The pattern continues through the 6 completed ages. This is unusual. Most religious traditions are conservative about their pantheons. The Greek tradition kept Zeus at the head from Mycenaean through Hellenistic times. The Egyptian tradition kept Re and Osiris and Horus across thousands of years of dynastic change. The Hebrew tradition is famously monotheist. The Vedic tradition, by contrast, embedded into its highest cosmological framework an explicit doctrine that gods change with ages. The current Indra is not the eternal Indra. The current sages are not the eternal sages. The pantheon is local to this Manvantara. This is the doctrinal corner that the alternative reading turns on. If the Vedic compilers had been inventing a religious cosmology, they would not have built into it a structure that demoted their own currently worshipped deities to provisional, time-limited roles. That is a strange thing to invent. It is not a strange thing to inherit. The second consequence is geographic. The Puranas locate the events of prior Manvantaras in specific places. They name mountains, they name rivers, they reference cosmographic regions, Jambudvipa, Sakadvipa, Plaxadvipa, that have been variously interpreted as mythical, as encoded geography of the known world, or as references to landmasses no longer present in the current geological configuration. The Mahabharata, in particular, in its descriptions of Bharatavarsha and its surrounding regions, gives details that some commentators have read as recognizable geographies, and others have read as theological cartography. If the Manvantara framework is chronologically literal, in the Vedic tradition's own terms, then its geographic specificity becomes more difficult to dismiss. The 6 prior ages would have unfolded on a planet whose continental arrangement was, by current geological understanding, substantially different from the present. The Puranic geography would, on this reading, preserve information about pre-current configurations of land and sea. This is not a small claim. It is the kind of claim that would, if substantiated, require revision of fields that currently operate on a Holocene-based timeline for human and proto-human civilizational activity. The third consequence is the one that most directly engages the Anunnaki literature. The Sumerian traditions, particularly as transmitted in the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis epic, and the antediluvian sections of the King List, describe a sequence of beings who descend from elsewhere, establish governance on Earth, rule for vast periods, conduct a flood, and then continue in a diminished role after a surviving human becomes the ancestor of the current population. The Vedic Manvantara framework describes a sequence of ages in which gods of vast longevity rule, periodically reset, with the current man emerging from a flood survival. Sitchin's claim, and the claim that has not been engaged in peer-reviewed Sanskritist or Assyriological literature, is that the 2 traditions are describing the same beings from 2 cultural standpoints. The Sumerians called them Anunnaki. The term in cuneiform breaks down as something approximating those who from heaven to earth came. The Vedic tradition called them Devas in the current Manvantara, and named different orders of beings in the prior ones. The Sumerians described their lineages, their hierarchies, their conflicts. The Vedic tradition does the same. The Sumerians described the flood. The Vedic tradition does the same. The Sumerians described a survivor through whom the present human population descends. The Vedic tradition does the same. If you accept that there is a real referent, that the 2 traditions are not just sharing an archetype but recording observations of the same phenomenon, then the conventional separation between Mesopotamian and Indic religious history collapses into something that requires a different framework to describe. The fourth consequence is methodological. If the Vedic numbers correspond by quantitative ratio to the Sumerian numbers, then someone in one of the source traditions, or in a common ancestor tradition, was doing arithmetic that was preserved across cultures. The Manvantara of 71 Mahayugas is not a number that emerges naturally from religious feeling. It is a calculation. 71 is a prime number. There is no obvious devotional reason for it. The Mahayuga itself, at 4,320,000 years, has a numerical structure. The 4 yugas, in a ratio of 4 to 3 to 2 to 1, each pegged to a base unit of 432,000 years that looks engineered rather than felt. The base unit of 432,000 is itself notable. It is the number of years the Sumerians give for the reign of the first antediluvian king in some recensions. It is the number that appears in the Norse Eddic tradition for the warriors of Valhalla. It is the number that, multiplied through, produces the Vedic Mahayuga. The historian of religion Joseph Campbell, not an alternative researcher but a Sarah Lawrence professor who held a chair in mythology there for nearly 4 decades, noted these numerical correspondences in his volume Oriental Mythology, published in 1962 as part of his Masks of God series. He did not draw Sitchin's conclusion from them, but he did observe the correspondence and described it as one of the unexplained features of comparative cosmology. The 5th consequence is the one that is hardest to articulate without sounding speculative, but it is implicit in the structure of the alternative reading. If the prior Manvantaras describe real pre-human civilizational phases, and if the gods of those Manvantaras were beings rather than archetypes, then the question of what those beings were, where they came from, and where they went becomes a historical question rather than a theological one. The Vedic texts answer this question, but they answer it in a religious register that is not currently translatable into the categories of modern history. The texts say the gods of the prior Manvantaras dissolved at the close of their respective ages. They say the bodies of those gods were not the same as the bodies of the current devas. They say the relationship between the current Indra and the previous Indras is one of office rather than of identity. There is a position called Indra, which different beings have occupied across the Manvantaras. The Vishnu Purana states this explicitly in Book 3. If you want to check this, the volume is in the Bodleian. The Sanskrit text is available in the Asiatic Society of Bengal's manuscript collection in Kolkata. The translation is Wilson's 1840. What the alternative reading offers then is not a single revolutionary claim. It is a structural correspondence between 3 textual traditions that, on the conventional account, should not have any quantitative relationship to each other. The correspondence is observable in the texts. It has been published. It has been described. And the academic response, the question of whether the correspondence is real and what it implies if real, has not been engaged. The academic response to Sitchin's Vedic Sumerian correlation in the 3.5 decades since the Lost Realms appeared in print has been remarkable for its character. It is worth describing what has not happened, because the absence is itself the most telling feature. No peer-reviewed Sanskritist journal has published an article engaging with the specific structural and numerical claims Sitchin made about the Manvantara King List correspondence. The Journal of the American Oriental Society, the flagship publication of the field, has not published a refutation. Neither has the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society. Neither has the Indo-Iranian Journal. Neither has the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies. The arithmetic Sitchin laid out is sitting in print, in a widely distributed trade book, and the field that would naturally be expected to engage it has not. The same is true in Assyriology. The standard reference works on the Sumerian King List, including Thorkild Jacobson's 1939 edition and the subsequent scholarly literature, make no reference to the Vedic parallel. The major mid-century Assyriologists, including Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania and A. Leo Oppenheim at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, did not engage with comparative readings against Indic sources. Their successors have not done so either. Stephanie Daly of Oxford, whose Myths from Mesopotamia is the standard Oxford World's Classics edition of the Mesopotamian flood narratives, treats the Anunnaki as theological figures within the Sumero-Akkadian tradition without extending the comparative frame to India. What has happened instead is characterization. Sitchin has been characterized as a popularizer. He has been characterized as an autodidact whose Sumerian was not standard. He has been characterized as drawing conclusions that the field would not endorse. He has been called pseudo-archaeological. His name appears in skeptical literature and in the broader genre of debunking books on alternative archaeology. But characterization is not refutation. Calling a methodology pseudo-archaeological does not address the specific claim that the Sumerian King List's flood survivor structure and the Vedic Vaivasvata flood survivor structure occupy parallel positions in their respective numerical sequences. Calling a researcher an autodidact does not address whether the comparative arithmetic he laid out is or is not arithmetically related to the text he cited. Refutation requires engaging with specific claims. Dismissal requires only a characterization. This is the pattern that the audience of this kind of script tends to recognize, because it is the pattern in many cases at the edge of mainstream archaeology. The methodology is dismissed without the specific findings being addressed. The researcher's lack of formal credentials is mentioned in lieu of an examination of the data. The work is grouped with other work that has been deemed beyond the pale, and the grouping does the rhetorical work that an actual refutation would have to do. There is one partial exception worth noting. The Sanskritist Edwin Bryant, formerly of Rutgers and now at Columbia, in his book The Quest for the Origins of Vedic Culture, published by Oxford University Press in 2001, surveys the broad field of alternative readings of Vedic chronology. He does not specifically engage Sitchin, but he treats the broader question of whether the Vedic chronological framework should be taken as historical with more openness than is typical in mainstream Sanskritist literature. Bryant's position is not that the Manvantara framework is historical. His position is that the question of how to evaluate Vedic chronology has been settled too quickly by the conventional academic consensus, and that the consensus rests on assumptions about the nature of Brahmanical scholarship that have not been adequately tested. This is the closest thing to engagement that the mainstream has offered, and it is, notably, not engagement with Sitchin's specific claim. It is engagement with the broader methodological question of how seriously to take Vedic chronology in general. The Anunnaki literature has fared no better. The term itself appears in mainstream Assyriological writing primarily as a descriptive term for a class of Sumero-Akkadian deities, chthonic, associated with the underworld in some recensions, with the heavens in others. The conventional reading treats them as gods. The alternative reading, that they were described by the Sumerians as physical beings who descended from elsewhere, ruled, intermarried with humans, conducted a flood, has been characterized as a misreading of religious metaphor. But the cuneiform texts the alternative readers cite are not in dispute. The Enuma Elish exists. The Atrahasis epic exists. The 11th tablet of Gilgamesh held in the British Museum exists. The Sumerian King List on the Weld-Blundell Prism exists. The interpretive question is whether the descriptions they contain are mythological or chronological. The mainstream has settled this question in favour of the mythological reading, but it has done so without engaging the comparative arithmetic that the alternative reading brings to bear. There is a deeper pattern here that the forensic skeptic viewer tends to notice. The fields of Sanskritist studies and Assyriology developed in the 18th and 19th centuries within a particular intellectual environment. The dominant assumption was that religious texts were religious, that they described inner spiritual realities rather than outer historical ones. This assumption was reasonable in the European context where it formed. It was an assumption shaped by the historical critical reading of the Bible, which in the 18th and 19th centuries was beginning to treat Scripture as the deposit of a particular human community's religious imagination, rather than as literal divine dictation. The same interpretive habit was carried into the reading of the Sanskrit and Mesopotamian sources. The texts were assumed to be religious, in the same sense that the Hebrew Bible had come to be read as religious. Their cosmological numbers were assumed to be devotional, not chronological. Their accounts of pre-human governance were assumed to be mythological, not historical. This is an interpretive assumption. It is not a finding. The texts themselves, in their own terms, do not present their cosmological numbers as devotional inflation. They present them as durations. The Vishnu Purana does not say, "I am offering you a meditation on the vastness of time." It says the 7th Manu, Vaivasvata, was preceded by 6 others, each of whom ruled for 71 Mahayugas. The grammar is declarative, the tone is repertorial. To read declarative, repertorial grammar as devotional inflation requires an interpretive move. It requires importing an assumption about what kind of text this is and what kind of work it is doing. The conventional academic reading makes this move. It makes the move so consistently and so early in the interpretive process that the move itself becomes invisible. It becomes simply how the texts are read. The alternative reading, which Sitchin and a smaller number of other researchers have offered, declines to make that interpretive move. It reads the texts in their declarative register. It treats the numbers as numbers. It asks whether the numbers in one text correlate with the numbers in another, and when they do, it asks why. The academic response to this approach has been, with the partial exception of Bryant and a few others, silence. Silence followed by characterization. The work has not been refuted, it has not been engaged. The question that it raises has not been answered seriously. To understand what is at stake in reading the Manvantara framework as something other than pure theology, it helps to step back into the world in which the framework was first articulated and to look at the people who articulated it. The traditional ascription of the Puranas in their present form is to a figure named Veda Vyasa, the compiler, who is also the traditional ascription of the Mahabharata. The historical Vyasa is unrecoverable. The tradition treats him as a single composite figure who organized the existing Vedic and Itihasa material into its present form. The work attributed to him represents the systematization of an oral tradition that had been transmitted in some form for centuries before being committed to manuscript. The Brahmin scholars who carried this tradition were not casual transmitters. They were trained in mnemonic and recitational disciplines that allowed the preservation of complex Sanskrit material across generations with extraordinary fidelity. The Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the Vedic texts and which references the Yuga framework in passing, was transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. The methods of preservation included not just memorization, but cross-checked recitation in multiple sequences, forward, backward, alternating, syllable-paired, that functioned as error correction. The transmission, by the time it reached the manuscripts that Wilson and Müller and Doniger have worked from, had been compressed through generations of trained memory. This is a feature of the Brahmanical tradition that the alternative reading tends to emphasize. The transmission is not the kind of casual oral folklore that mutates with retelling. It is high-fidelity preservation by trained specialists. If the cosmological numbers in the Puranas are present in the form they are, the transmission system that preserved them was not the kind of system in which numbers would have drifted by accident. They were preserved deliberately. The question is whether they were preserved as theological furniture or as chronological information. The cosmological framework itself, in its full elaborated form, runs as follows. The smallest unit of cosmic time that the framework treats is the Yuga. There are 4 Yugas, Krita, Treta, Dvapara and Kali. They run in descending order of duration and ascending order of moral disorder. Krita Yuga is the age of perfection. Its duration is 1,728,000 years. Treta Yuga is the next age. Its duration is 1,296,000 years. Dvapara Yuga is the third. Its duration is 864,000 years. Kali Yuga is the current age. Its duration is 432,000 years. The proportions are clean. Each Yuga is built on a base unit of 432,000 years. Krita is 4 units. Treta is 3. Dvapara is 2. Kali is 1. The total is 10 units, 4,320,000 years, and this is the duration of one Mahayuga, or Great Age. The Mahayuga is not the largest unit. 71 Mahayugas, together with the Sandhya periods that bracket them, make up one Manvantara. The duration of one Manvantara by the standard reckoning is approximately 306,720,000 years. 14 Manvantaras, again with interleaved Sandhya transitions, make up one Kalpa. A Kalpa is 1 day of Brahma. Its duration is approximately 4,320,000,000 years. A day of Brahma is followed by a night of Brahma of equal duration. Together they constitute a full day-night cycle of Brahma. 360 such cycles make a year of Brahma. Brahma lives for 100 years of Brahma. The total duration of Brahma's life is in years, approximately 311,040,000,000,000 years. These are the numbers. They are sitting in the text. They have been transmitted with high fidelity by a tradition that was capable of high-fidelity transmission. The question of how to read them, whether as devotional inflation or as chronological framework, is not a question about whether the numbers are present. It is a question about what kind of statement the texts are making when they present them. The current age, by this framework, is the Kali Yuga of the 28th Mahayuga of the 7th Manvantara of the current Kalpa. The 7th Manvantara is named after its presiding Manu, Vaivasvata, the son of Vivasvat, who is sometimes rendered Vivasvant, the solar deity. Vaivasvata is the Manu who survives the Great Flood. He is the ancestor of the current human population. He is the figure to whom the current Indra, the current Saptarishis, the current cosmic order all trace. The Indian astronomer and mathematician Aryabhata, who lived in the 5th century CE, and who wrote the Aryabhatiya in approximately 499 CE, computed a starting date for the Kali Yuga. By his calculation, the Kali Yuga began at the start of February 18th of 3102 BCE. This date has been transmitted in the Indian astronomical tradition. It is not Sitchin's, it is Aryabhata's, and it is a specific calendrical claim, a date at which the previous Yuga is held to have ended and the current one to have begun. The 7 sages of the current Manvantara are named. They are Kashyapa, Atri, Vasishtha, Vishvamitra, Gautama, Jamadagni, and Bharadvaja. They are the Saptarishis. They appear in the Vedic hymns as the original seers, the rishis who heard the Vedas and transmitted them. They are also identified with the 7 stars of Ursa Major. The Indian astronomical tradition holds that the position of the Saptarishi stars changes across the ages, that they are a kind of cosmic clock, indicating by their drift the progression of the Yuga sequence. This identification of the 7 sages with the 7 stars is one of the older elements in the framework. It is in the Shatapatha Brahmana, which the Sanskritist Julius Egling translated for the Sacred Books of the East series in the late 19th century. The Shatapatha Brahmana dates, in its core layers, to approximately 800 BCE, older than the Vishnu Purana as a redacted text, older than the Mahabharata as a redacted text, contemporary with the late Vedic period in northern India. The Saptarishi clock, as some Indian astronomers refer to it, was the basis of an indigenous calendrical reckoning that operated alongside the lunar and solar calendars. The Kalachuri kings, who ruled parts of central India in the early medieval period, used a Saptarishi era in their inscriptions. The era is sometimes called the Lokika era. It is still used in the traditional Kashmiri calendar. The framework, in other words, was not abstract theology to the people who lived inside it. It was a structure for keeping time. Inscriptions were dated by it. Astronomical observations were oriented to it. The Indra of the current Manvantara was a position with a name, the same way the position of Pharaoh in Egypt or the position of Emperor in China was a position with a name, and the texts treated the predecessors of the current Indra as historical figures with their own pantheons and their own ages. The current Indra is named Purandara. The previous Indra, in the Kakshusha Manvantara, the 6th, was named Manojava. Before him, in the Vaivasvata Manvantara, the 5th, was Vibhu. Before him, in the Tamasa Manvantara, the 4th was Shibi. Before him, in the Uttama Manvantara, the 3rd was Sushanti. Before him, in the Svaroshisha Manvantara, the 2nd was Vipaschit. And in the 1st, the Svayambhuva Manvantara, the chief deity was not Indra at all but Yajna, who occupied the equivalent role. These are specific names. They are recorded in the Vishnu Purana in Book 3. They are recorded in the Bhagavata Purana in Skanda 8. They are recorded in the Markandeya Purana. They are not invented for this video. They have been sitting in print, in Wilson's translation, and in the translations of others since the 19th century. The texts also record the 7 sages of each prior Manvantara. The Saptarishis of the Svayambhuva Manvantara were a different 7. The Saptarishis of the Svaroshisha Manvantara were a different 7 again. The texts give the lineages, the parentages, the affiliations. They give which gods sided with the Manu of that age and which sided against him. They give the manner in which each Manvantara ended, which is in most cases a destruction by water, but in some cases a destruction by fire or by wind. This is the part of the texts that the alternative reading takes most seriously. The Puranas do not just say there were prior ages. They give the specific personnel of those ages. They name the rulers. They name the sages. They name the gods. They name the manners of dissolution. If this were pure theological invention, it would represent an extraordinary investment in specificity for no apparent religious purpose. The religious purpose of cyclical time is served by stating that there are prior ages. The religious purpose is not served by listing the names of their Indras. The reading that treats the specificity as deliberate, as the kind of preservation a record-keeping tradition would undertake, has a different account of why the texts are as detailed as they are. On that reading, the texts are preserving information about a deep past that the tradition's compilers believe to be real. The information is encoded in the religious register because that was the register in which the tradition operated. But the underlying intent is record-keeping, not religious imagination. This is the deep claim that the alternative reading rests on. It is not a claim that the religious framing should be discarded. It is a claim that the religious framing was the form in which a chronologically literal record was transmitted, and that the chronological literalness can be extracted from the religious framing without doing violence to the texts. The world in which these texts were transmitted, in the early centuries of the Common Era when the Puranas were taking their present form, was the world of post-Mauryan India. The Mauryan Empire had ended in approximately 185 BCE with the assassination of its last emperor Brihadrartha. The successor period saw the rise of regional dynasties, the Shungas, the Kanvas, the Satavahanas in the Deccan, the Kushans in the northwest. It was a period of political fragmentation but of intense literary activity. The major Sanskrit dramas, the redaction of the Mahabharata, the compilation of the Puranas, the formalization of the Dharmasastras, all of this happened in the same broad cultural moment. The compilers worked in centres like Pataliputra, Mathura, Ujjayini, and Kanchipuram. They were Brahmin scholars trained in the recitation and exegesis of the Vedic corpus. They were not isolated. They were in contact with the Hellenistic kingdoms to the west, with the Buddhist communities of Central Asia, with the Tamil cultural centres of the south. They knew their own tradition deeply, and they knew that their tradition contained material older than themselves. What they preserved, in the form they preserved it, is the question that the alternative reading is asking. Did they preserve what they understood to be theological convention? Or did they preserve, in a theological register, information about a past that their tradition believed to be literal? The Manvantara framework, with its named Indras and named sages and specific durations, is the test case. The answer is not given by the texts themselves. It is given by what happens when the framework is checked against external evidence. And the most striking external evidence is the structural correspondence with the Sumerian and Egyptian timelines that Sitchin laid out, and that mainstream scholarship has not engaged. The structural correspondence becomes most legible when the Vedic framework is placed alongside the Sumerian King List, which is the textual artifact that bears the closest formal resemblance to the Manvantara doctrine. The Sumerian King List exists in multiple recensions and copies. The most complete and best preserved version is inscribed on a four-sided clay prism, roughly 20 centimetres tall, catalogued at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. It was acquired by Herbert Weld-Blundell in the early 20th century from excavations conducted by an Anglo-American expedition to the city of Larsa in southern Mesopotamia. It was published in 1923 by Stephen Langdon, who held the chair of Assyriology at Oxford. The text is in Sumerian cuneiform, dating to approximately 1800 BCE as a physical object, but the King List tradition it preserves extends much further back. The text opens with a formulaic line. When kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Eridu is the oldest city in the Sumerian tradition. Its god was Enki, who in the Atrahasis epic is the deity who warns the flood survivor of the coming destruction. The first king named on the list is Alulim. His reign is given as 28,800 years. The list continues, Alalgar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Then the kingship moves to Bad Tibira, then to Larak, then to Sippar, then to Shurupak. The kings of these antediluvian cities reign for tens of thousands of years each. The total, combined reign of the antediluvian kings in the standard reckoning of the Weld-Blundell Prism is approximately 241,200 years. After the 8th antediluvian king, the text records a flood. The formula is sharp, then the flood swept thereover. After the flood had swept thereover, when the kingship was lowered again from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. From this point the reigns become shorter. The first post-flood king at Kish, Jushur, is given a more plausible figure. The lifespans continue to decline through subsequent dynasties until they reach historically recognizable durations for kings like Sargon of Akkad, whose reign is given as 56 years. The structural parallel with the Vedic Manvantara doctrine is immediate, a sequence of pre-flood ages ruled by beings of vast longevity, a flood, a break, a diminished post-flood order, the same shape. The numerical parallel is harder to dismiss as coincidence. 241,200 years on the Weld-Blundell Prism, the Vedic Manvantara reckoned as 71 Mahayugas, The ratio between these two numbers is not direct, but Sitchin's argument is that they are related by a unit conversion factor that he interpreted in terms of orbital periods of the planetary body he proposed in the 12th planet. That part of his argument depends on accepting his broader cosmological hypothesis about an additional planet in the solar system. The forensic skeptic viewer is not obliged to follow him into that. What does not depend on the broader hypothesis is the structural parallel itself, the pattern of pre-flood ages, the flood, the survivor, and the diminished post-flood continuation. A second comparative source is the chronology of the Egyptian priest Manetho. Manetho was a Heliopolitan priest who wrote, in approximately the early 3rd century BCE, a chronicle of Egyptian dynasties in Greek. The original work is lost. It is preserved in fragmentary citations through later authors, primarily Josephus, Africanus, and Eusebius. The fragments give different numbers, and the reconstruction of Manetho's original chronology is a vexed scholarly question. But the broad shape of his framework, as preserved in the citations, runs as follows. Egyptian history begins with the gods. The gods ruled for thousands of years. They were followed by the demigods, who also ruled for vast periods. The demigods were followed by the spirits of the dead. The spirits were followed by the human pharaohs of the historical dynasties. The structure is again the same. Pre-human governance of vast duration, transition, diminished post-transition order. Manetho gives different numbers. His total for the divine and semi-divine periods runs to approximately 24,900 years in some reconstructions, with much larger figures in others. The figures do not match the Sumerian or the Vedic numbers in detail. But the structural template, 3 phases of pre-human dominion, transition, current diminished human order, is the same template. 3 independent textual traditions, Mesopotamian, Indic, Egyptian, composed in 3 unrelated languages, recorded in 3 unrelated scripts, separated by thousands of kilometers and by centuries of transmission. Each describes a sequence of pre-human governance by beings of immense longevity, ending in a break, followed by a diminished current order. The conventional explanation for this structural correspondence is one of 2 things, or some combination of them. First, that there is a universal mythological archetype of a golden age followed by a fall, and that the 3 traditions are independently expressing the same archetypal pattern. This is the explanation associated with the comparative mythology tradition, descending from Friedrich Max Müller through Mircea Eliade and into figures like Joseph Campbell. Second, that there is a real but ordinary historical phenomenon of flood memory in regions that experienced major Holocene-era floods, and that the 3 traditions are independently mythologizing roughly similar memories. Both of these explanations account for some features of the correspondence. They account for the broad structural similarity. They do not, on close examination, account for the specificity. The Manvantara framework's 71 Mahayuga unit, the Sumerian King List's 8 antediluvian kings, the Manetho fragment's 3-phase pre-human structure. These are specific numerical features that an archetypal pattern explanation should not predict. The archetype would predict broad similarity. It would not predict numerical scaffolding that, by Sitchin's analysis, and by certain other comparative readers, can be related across traditions by what looks like unit conversion mathematics. The flood memory explanation faces a different problem. The 3 flood narratives, Mesopotamian, Indic, Egyptian, describe floods that, on the conventional historical reading, would have to be real but unrelated events. The Atrahasis flood is sometimes located, by mainstream Assyriology, in the major sediment deposits at the city of Shurapak that have been dated to approximately 2900 BCE. The Vedic flood is given no firm date by the conventional reading, because the tradition is treated as theological. The Egyptian transition is also undated by the conventional reading. The flood memory explanation requires 3 roughly contemporaneous but unrelated floods, each independently memorialized in a vastly elaborated cosmological framework, and it requires the elaborations to happen to take a similar structural form for unrelated reasons. The alternative reading offers a single referent, 1 event, 1 survivor, 1 cultural lineage that branched in the millennia after the event into the Sumerian, Indic, and Egyptian traditions, each of which preserved the same structural memory in its own register. The texts do not agree on the duration, they do not agree on the names of the gods, they agree on the shape. This is the kind of cross-cultural correspondence that has, in other fields, been treated as evidence of a common source. the shared Indo-European root vocabulary of Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Germanic and Slavic languages is taken as evidence of a Proto-Indo-European source. The shared narrative structures of certain folktale types are taken as evidence of common origin or deep diffusion. The mainstream is willing to accept structural correspondence as evidence of common source in linguistic and folkloric domains. It has been less willing to accept the same kind of correspondence as evidence in cosmological and chronological domains. This is the question that has been characterized as fringe but not refuted. Why does the same structural framework appear in three traditions that should have no quantitative relationship? The alternative reading offers an answer. The mainstream reading offers either an archetype or a coincidence of independent floods. Neither of the mainstream answers accounts for the specificity. The alternative answer does. And the alternative answer has not been seriously engaged. The strongest objection to the alternative reading is not the credentials objection. It is the diffusion objection, and it is worth presenting in its strongest form because the forensic skeptic viewer who reaches this point in the script will already be considering it. The diffusion objection runs as follows. The Indo-European language family, of which Sanskrit is the easternmost major branch and Greek and Latin and the Germanic and Slavic languages are western branches, is well established by mainstream historical linguistics. The Proto-Indo-European source, whose existence is inferred from systematic regularities in the daughter languages, was spoken somewhere in the steppe region north of the Black and Caspian Seas by the conventional reconstruction sometime around 4000 BCE. The speakers of Proto-Indo-European, on the conventional account, fragmented and spread. Some went west into Europe, some went south into Anatolia, some went southeast into Iran and India. They carried with them not just vocabulary but mythological structures. The work of Georges Dumézil, the French Indo-Europeanist who taught at the Collège de France for much of the 20th century, established that the Indo-European cultures share a tripartite social and theological structure, a priestly function, a warrior function, and a productive function. This shared structure is, on the conventional reading, an inheritance from the common Proto-Indo-European past. If Indo-European mythological structures can diffuse this widely, from Iceland to India, then the structural similarity between Vedic and Mesopotamian cosmologies can be explained by a similar diffusion. The Indo-European migrations through Iran could have brought Vedic ideas into contact with Mesopotamian ones, or vice versa. The Akkadians, who composed the Atrahasis epic in approximately the 18th century BCE, were a Semitic people, not an Indo-European one. But they ruled a region that was a cultural crossroads, and ideas can cross linguistic boundaries even when populations do not. This is the strongest version of the conventional answer. It does not require coincidence. It does not require independent invention. It requires only that some early body of mythology spread, in the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, across the Indo-European and Near Eastern cultural sphere, and that the three traditions we have today are local elaborations of that diffused substrate. The diffusion explanation has real force. It accounts for the broad structural similarity. It accounts for some of the shared archetypes. It is consistent with what historical linguistics has established about the spread of Indo-European cultural forms. But the diffusion explanation does not account for the specific numerical features. Dumézil's tripartite structure is qualitative. The Manvantara framework, by contrast, is quantitative. It gives durations in specific multiples, 71 Mahayugas to a Manvantara, 10 units of 432,000 years to a Mahayuga, 14 Manvantaras to a Kalpa. These are arithmetic relations. They are not the kind of feature that diffuses through folk memory across a millennium. They are the kind of feature that has to be transmitted with high precision, or it does not transmit at all. If the Sumerian and Vedic numbers were similar in a vague way, both large, both round, both encoding long periods, diffusion would explain it. But the specific numerical relations Sitchin identified are not vague. They are arithmetic, and the diffusion model does not have a good account of how arithmetic precision crosses cultural boundaries without an institutional transmission mechanism. The diffusion explanation also does not account for the position of the survivor parallel. In the Sumerian list, the survivor occupies a position after 8 pre-flood kings. In the Vedic framework, the current Manu, Vaivasvata the 7th, is preceded by 6 completed prior Manvantaras. The numbers are not identical, but they are in the same range, in the same structural position with the same function. Diffusion of vague archetypes does not predict position-specific numerical correspondence. It predicts thematic resemblance. The state of the debate is genuinely unresolved. The diffusion explanation is the strongest mainstream answer. It has not been refuted, but it has not, on close examination of the specific quantitative features, been shown to be sufficient. The question of whether there is a deeper correspondence that diffusion cannot explain remains open, and it is the kind of question that requires specific engagement to settle, engagement that the mainstream has to this point declined to provide. If the structural correspondence holds, if the Vedic Manvantara framework and the Sumerian King List and the Egyptian Manetho fragments are recording the same underlying account in three cultural registers, then a number of things in conventional historiography would have to be revised. The timeline of cultural and possibly biological human prehistory would need to extend. The current consensus places anatomically modern humans in Africa by approximately 300,000 years ago, and behaviourally modern humans in various regions from roughly 50,000 years ago. The cultural civilizational timeline on the conventional reading begins much later, with the earliest known proto-urban sites at approximately 10,000 BCE and the first writing systems at approximately 3200 BCE. The texts under discussion on the alternative reading reference governance structures that predate this timeline by orders of magnitude. The categories of god and ruler would need to be reconsidered in the source traditions. If the Anunnaki of the Sumerian sources and the Devas of the prior Manvantaras in the Vedic sources are not pure theological constructions but references to beings or governance structures that the source traditions believe to be real, then the question of who these beings were and what their relationship to early humans was becomes a historical question rather than a mythological one. And the seventh Manvantara, the one we are currently inside, would have to be understood not as the world but as a phase that began with a flood survivor approximately at the position the Vedic tradition places him, a phase that has been running for whatever fraction of 71 Mahayugas the tradition assigns to it, a phase that is, by the framework's own arithmetic, still in its early portion. The seventh still lingers. It is still going. The completion of this Manvantara is, by the tradition's own reckoning, a long way off. The Vishnu Purana is in the Bodleian Library at Oxford. The translation is Wilson's. The publication year is 1840. The Sanskrit text is older. The Manvantara framework, the 14 Manus, the durations in Mahayugas, the explicit doctrine that the gods of the prior ages were different from the gods of this one, is preserved in Book 3. Zekhara Sitchin published The Lost Realms in 1990. He laid out the comparative arithmetic between the Vedic framework and the Sumerian King List. He died in 2010. His specific claim about the structural correspondence has not been refuted in any peer-reviewed Sanskritist or Assyriological literature. What Wilson translated in 1840, what Langdon translated in 1923, and what Sitchin compared in 1990 are all in print. The texts are available, the arithmetic is available. The question of whether the three traditions are recording the same underlying substrate, or whether their structural correspondence is coincidence, is still open. It has been open since the texts were first compared. It is still open now.